talk about scatterplots. Scatterplots are one of my favorite kind of graphs because they have a lot of dots and they just look really fun to look at. So with a scatter plot, when I think of the word scatter, I think about things all over the place. Like if you scattered your clothes all around the room, that means they're not just in one nice neat corner, you have them all over the place. If I were to throw my pencils everywhere and they scattered across the floor, we have pencils everywhere in this room. So scatter plots is where we're taking dots, and yes, we're going to use our data points to dot or to graph those plots, but they're not always going to be this nice, beautiful line of dots like we're used to. They might be all over the place. So I'm going to use this data right here to create my scatter plot. So it looks like my x-axis is going to be the age, and my y-axis is teaspoon of sugar per cup. So I'm going to go ahead and label my axes with those titles. So we said our x was the age. I'm going to turn it sideways so I can write my y-axis. My y-axis is teaspoon of sugar per cup. So it looks like the question that they might have asked people is, how old are you and how much sugar do you put in maybe your tea or your coffee? I don't know, something in cup. So we might make our title amount of sugar. I like coffee, so I'm going to make it in coffee per coffee cup. So what we're going to do is we're going to take these points and let's plot them on our graph. I'm going to zoom in just a little bit so it's easier to see. Okay, there we go. Focus. All right. So it looks like our first person was 7 years old. Oh, hopefully they're not drinking coffee. Maybe it's decaf. But 7 years old, and they put 1 2/10 cup teaspoon of sugar in their coffee cup. So when I look at my x-axis, my scale of the x-axis is currently counting by tens. So that means in between each of them would be counting by 5. So I'm going to go ahead and label that just to help me find my age 7 a little bit better. So age 7 would be about right in the middle of 5 and 10. When I look at my y-axis, I only have 3 numbers on there, but my scale is actually not counting by halves. My scale, if I look from 0 to 5/10, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 lines. So my scale is actually counting by tenths. So I'm going to label that in just to kind of help me a little bit more. And we should have done this before we looked at the data, but we're doing it now. So that gets us to 1 whole, and then 1 1/10, 1 2/10, 1 3. Oop, goodness gracious, 1 3/10. I forgot how to write for a second. 1 4/10. Okay, so if our person that we've surveyed is about 7 years old and they put 1 2/10 up of teaspoon of sugar in their cup, so I'm going to go to x is 7 all the way up to y is 1 2/10, and I'm going to plot a dot. Our next person we surveyed is 15 years old, and they only put 1 teaspoon of sugar in their cup. So we're going to find 15 years old on the x-axis, 1 teaspoon on the y-axis, and plot a dot. Our next person is 35 years old, and they put only 3/10 of a teaspoon of sugar in their cup. So here's 35 on the age, 3/10 on the y. One 18-year-old puts 8/10 of a teaspoon. So 18 would be a little bit closer to 20 and 8/10, about right there. So see how you can already tell that it's not making a perfectly straight line. It's kind of weaving a little bit. Remember, that's okay on a scatter plot. We're not looking for a totally straight line. Our next 18-year-old only puts 6/10 of a teaspoon of sugar in their cup. So I know where my 18 is. I'm going to put a 6/10 down here. Our 29-year-old likes to put 6/10 of a teaspoon in her cup. So 26 is pretty close to 25. We'll put a dot right there. The 44-year-old likes to put 7/10 of a teaspoon. So 44 is pretty close to 45 and 7/10. The 53-year-old puts nothing. They like their coffee black. I respect it. So 53 is about right there. And then our 51-year-old only puts half a teaspoon. So 51 is pretty close to 50 and half. Okay, so one of the things that we've never had before on a graph is we've never had 2 points that share the same x value. We've had some that share the same y, but never the same x. So that's a new thing with our scatter plots. So now that we've got all of our points plotted, here are some things that we look for on a scatter plot. We call it a trend line or the line of best fit. So in order to find the line of best fit, you're going to use a ruler or the edge of your paper, something straight, to draw a trend line over the data points on the graph, and your goal is to get the same number of points on each side of the line. Now, of course, it's never going to be perfectly split down the middle, but your goal is to get about the same on each side. So I'm going to grab just a sheet of paper that I have. And I'm going to try and angle it to where it looks like I have about half of them on each side. So that's going to be probably about right here. Now, again, I'm not connecting dots. That's not what I'm trying to do. I'm just trying to kind of split them down the middle. Ooh, and it wasn't perfect, so I'm going to try one more time. It's a good thing about using a erasable pen is we can give it one more go. It looks like I was angled a little too much to the right. So let's try it again. Maybe angle it a little bit more down. Let's try here. Okay, that looks a little bit better. So yes, I did connect some of the dots, but again, you don't have to on a scatter plot. We're just trying to draw that trend line there. So what the trend line tells us is it helps us see what we call the correlation between age and the teaspoon of sugar per cup. So correlation means how do they relate? How do they go together? So if when we draw that trend line, it's facing in an up diagonal direction, then our data has what we call a positive correlation. So that would be if my line went like this. As the age increases, then so does the teaspoon of sugar per cup. So that would be both your X and your Y data points increase together. Now, if it looks like ours and it's going down, this is what we call a negative correlation. So that means as our X increases, our Y is decreasing. So as our age, as people get older, they tend to put less sugar in their cups of coffee. And then sometimes you pick two things to graph that have absolutely no correlation, none at all. If I were to try to draw a line and get the same amount on each side, I could work going positive, it could work going negative, so there would be no correlation. An example of no correlation could be something like asking how many people asking people how many letters are in their first name and how many siblings they have. Well, the number of letters in your first name isn't going to have any effect on the number of siblings you have, so that would have no correlation. Something that could have positive correlation would be, let's say, the more you study, how many minutes you study, and your grade on a test or a project. So the longer you study, typically the better your grade gets, so they're both increasing together. But when we look at our graph, we do have a negative correlation. As age increases, our teaspoon of sugar per cup is decreasing. So we have a negative correlation. Now, the other thing our trend line helps us do is it helps us predict data. So it says which would you expect to be most likely for a 38-year-old? Well, when we look at our data, we didn't survey anyone was 38 years old. But I can go over here on my graph and find where about 38 should be, which would be kind of right in the middle of 35 and 40, maybe a little bit closer to 40. And I can see where would that hit on my graph. And that would be probably about right here. So we're at 38, just to kind of help us remember. So when I look at it, it looks like a 38-year-old should put about maybe 15 hundredths of a teaspoon of sugar, somewhere in between 1/10 and 2/10. So when we look at our options, I've got 2/10 of a teaspoon, 5/10 of a teaspoon, or 1 1/10 of a teaspoon. Again, I didn't interview a 38-year-old, but I can predict that they probably would be closest to that 2/10 of a teaspoon.